Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to be talking about humanoids. If you've watched this channel, you know I love covering humanoid cases, particularly cases that are not well known, have unique aspects to them, have something to teach us about the extraterrestrial presence on this planet. And I think the 10 cases I have for you today fit that bill. The title of today's episode is Frozen in Fear, 10 very scary close encounters with extraterrestrial humanoids. Fear does seem to be a common factor in these kinds of cases, which is certainly understandable. The 10 cases I have for you today are both historical and current. In fact, I've got a case that goes all the way back to 1850 and one as recent as 2007. And we see all different types of ETs. So there are, of course, grays, probably the most common type I hear, but human-looking, beings that aren't quite human-looking, but close. Also, one case involving a couple of hairy humanoids, which is always interesting to me, and cases from all over the world, including Argentina, China, England, Italy, Georgia, Kentucky, Illinois, Michigan, Mississippi, and Missouri. So let's just get going with our first case, which I call Something Watching Me. This occurred around 1928 in Leicester, England. It's a fascinating case of a daylight UFO landing and a pretty unusual humanoid. This very early case comes from Mrs. Pauline Berger, whose son convinced her to go public with her sighting of a strange humanoid after he read a strikingly similar account in a UFO magazine. So Pauline's father often took Pauline for walks in the fields along Anstey Lane in Leicester, England. At that time, this area was far more rural than it is today, and it was one hot summer day in 1928 that they had taken a walk through the fields. Pauline's father settled down to have a nap while Pauline sat next to him reading a book. And as Pauline says, I suddenly became aware of something watching me and saw what I took at first to be a scarecrow. It looked like a scarecrow because of its odd shape and the fact that it was all in black and did not appear to have any face, although it had a large head. I was some distance from it, so it may have well had features which I could not discern. But I did notice that its arms were long and dangling. Being interested in my book, I dismissed it as being just a scarecrow and continued to read. However, I could feel it watching me. So this strange feeling finally encouraged Pauline to take a second and closer look at this figure. And as she says, on looking up again, I saw by the side of it what I first took to be a hut. As the hut had not been there before, I became frightened and tried to wake up my father. When I eventually woke him up, the scarecrow and the hut had disappeared. Now this experience, although brief, left a very lasting impression on young Pauline, and it was something that she never forgot. As she says, for years afterward, the tale of the disappearing scarecrow had always been a big joke with my family. My son, who is familiar with my scarecrow story, on looking through the Flying Saucer Review, came up to me and said, "Look, Mummy, isn't this what you saw?" And he began to show her images of a very well-known incident in France, where two young siblings came upon a large spherical-shaped craft with several black figures standing around it. And this definitely triggered a memory in Pauline of this very early incident. As she says, the sphere and the black figures were absolutely identical to my scarecrow and the hut. My black figure must have been about 5 feet in height and reminded me of an octopus but with fewer legs. I remember thinking at the time, what a funny hut it was, because it was like a large globe on legs. I like that case, particularly because it's such an early case. Cases that predate the modern age of ufology, around 1947 or so, I think are really important because they show that this is something that's been going on for a very long time. I think this case also illustrates a couple of interesting aspects. One is that it's sometimes very difficult to wake up the other person who is apparently maybe somehow entranced. It's a weird aspect that I think we don't fully understand, why some people kind of fall asleep during a UFO encounter. Another really interesting aspect to me about this particular case is that this lady kept this pretty much a secret, telling only her family for many years, until suddenly she got some confirmation from another source and bravely stepped forward. So that is also a very common aspect we see to UFO encounters. Now let's move to the next one. This has got to be my favorite in this particular compilation. It's always hard to choose a favorite because I've got a couple, but this one is definitely got a wow factor to it. I call this one Frozen in Fear. This occurred primarily in August of 1930 in a very rural area of Piedmont, Missouri. This very early humanoid case was reported to MUFON by a lady who was 96 years old and decided that it was time to share her humanoid encounters, which she experienced with her family way back in 1930 when she was only 10 years old. The witness, I'll call her Edna, that is a pseudonym, lived with her extended family in a rural area outside of Piedmont, Missouri, on a farm that had been in their family since the 1850s. And even way back then, they were being visited by what appear to be gray extraterrestrials. Because, as Edna says, I remember that my mother and grandmother told stories about the little gray people who visited the farm at night, and that the stories were in the family since before the Civil War. The family says that it has been happening since the 1850s. So apparently these little gray people never stopped visiting, and it wouldn't be long before Edna herself had her own encounter with them. And I'll just let her describe it in her own words. As Edna says, "When I was a kid, whoever was the youngest had to sleep on the sleeping porch of the house. None of us wanted to sleep there because the little people would visit, and we were all afraid of them. One night in particular, when I was 10 years old, I was lying in bed on the porch, and I saw a gray being with big eyes walk up to the window and look inside at me. I was frozen in fear. He just kept looking at me. The next thing I knew, there were 3 of them, all about 4 feet tall and thin, with no hair, big black eyes, small nose and mouth, standing next to my bed. I remember thinking that I had no idea how they got inside. I was even more afraid and wanted to pull the covers up over my face, but I couldn't. I don't know what happened after that. The next morning I woke up and they were gone. They never appeared during the day, only at night." So Edna says that she herself never saw any craft of any kind, but many other strange things happened on that farm that were witnessed by the entire family. As Edna says, sometimes late at night, we would hear a humming sound coming from the low depression area around the pond about 100 feet from the house, but never went to look to see what it was. I think we were afraid to. We often saw small white balls of light in the yard and around the farm at dusk and after dusk, but never knew what they were. The lights were about the size of a softball. So this strange activity on the farm affected the behavior of the entire family. As Edna says, the whole family was sure to be inside after dark, and we just didn't play outside after dark. The older family members made sure we came inside. And as I think back on this, it must have been because of the little people who would take us. That is the term my mother and grandmother used. They would say that the little gray people would take us at night, but always brought us back before morning. It was almost like talking about fairies or something magical that was our little secret. It was not something we spoke about to other people. We kept it to ourselves and still do to this day. So Edna eventually grew up, she got married and had children. The family still lives on this same farm, and this did not stop Edna from being visited by the little gray people. And she, of course, was not the only one who saw them either. As Edna says, "I still see them sometimes, only inside the house where I sleep now. I see them come in late at night, usually around 3 a.m., but for some reason I just fall asleep and don't remember any interaction with them. I don't let anyone sleep on the porch though. My children and grandchildren have also seen the gray people. We are not so afraid of them anymore. We just look at them as being visitors rather than something that will harm us. So while Edna finally did go public, she insists upon anonymity and shuns all attention. As she says, I don't want any publicity or anyone to know who I am, because they'll think I'm nuts. But I'm not. I may be old, but I am strong and take care of myself and have all my faculties. How amazing is that? I bet if I talked to these witnesses, I could write an entire book about their experiences. It's clearly a lot more going on than is in this report. But what's so fascinating to me is they have a family tradition of these encounters reaching all the way back to 1850. So that's more than a few generations here. It's a really good example of how certain families seem to have this running through their whole family history. We know ET contact is generational. Yeah, this is a really good example of that. So maybe there's something about this farm area that they're interested in. We certainly do know ETs love farms for whatever reason. But yeah, such a fascinating case. Now let's move to the next one. This one's also really unusual. A daylight encounter with a very close-up humanoid and a UFO. I call this one Black Staring Eyes. This one occurred on January 5, 1966 in La Harpe, Illinois. Yes, it is a single witness case, but she saw this thing so close up that I think it's an important observation. This case was first presented in an article titled Report on Craft and Occupant Seen Near La Harpe, Illinois, 1966. It was written by MUFON field investigator Robert Smulling, and it appeared in the August 1970 issue of Skylook, which was the predecessor to the MUFON UFO Journal, published by the MUFON UFO Network. The case comes from Violet Bricker, who sent a letter about her encounter to MUFON, and she was later interviewed by both Walt Andrus Jr., the co-founder and director of MUFON, and investigator Robert Smulling. It was a cold morning, about 8:15 a.m. on January 5, 1966, as Violet headed northbound on State Highway 94, about 2 miles north of La Harpe, Illinois. She had 3 Schnauzer pups in the back seat. Up ahead in the distance, she suddenly saw a silvery flash of light, and her first thought was that it was a small plane coming towards her from the northwest. But as it drew closer, she saw that it looked more like a dirigible, and it appeared to be coming directly towards her on a collision course. It moved very quickly, and before she had a chance to react, it was hovering just above the telephone lines across the road opposite her. And she could now see that this object was actually kind of an oval or egg-shaped craft about the size of a Piper Cub aircraft, more than 10 feet thick. It had one huge, very bright yellow-white light on the end facing her. There were no markings, doors, windows, or landing gear visible, but she did see what appeared to be a single line bisecting it in the midsection. She could not hear any sound coming from the craft, and this craft now began to slowly turn or rotate clockwise. And soon the other end of the craft came into view, and Violet got a huge shock. She immediately became petrified, because now, on the other end of the craft, she saw a man standing on a small platform about 2 feet wide, sticking out from the side of the craft. And this man looked human. He had a ruddy complexion. He was only about 5.5 feet tall. He was wearing a white one-piece suit with a hood, which reminded Violet somewhat of an asbestos suit. She said it made his body appear stocky. This man had one hand on his hip, and the other was resting against the side of the craft. But what really frightened Violet was that the man was staring down directly at her with, quote, black staring eyes. She said that she will, quote, never forget the way this man stared at her. So Violet was so stunned, she doesn't remember bringing her car to a stop. What she does remember is that there was another car which had parked alongside the road about 20 feet ahead of her, right near the entrance to a farm. A woman was in the front seat and a man stood by the driver's side and was sticking his head in the car, and it looked to Violet like they were having an argument. But seeing the craft with the strange man on the platform, Violet tried frantically to get their attention by waving and pounding on the window and pointing, but she was unable to get the attention of the couple. Now at this point, the craft continued to rotate and the man was lost to view. The craft continued to rotate, and when the other end came around again, the man and the platform were gone. At this point, the craft now climbed higher and higher upwards, and then suddenly left very rapidly in a flash. Much faster than a jet is how Violet described it. She's not exactly sure how long this encounter lasted, but estimates it was about 5 minutes. She continued on her interrupted journey. She says that her Schnauzer puppies, which were normally very frisky, during the encounter they did not make any sound at all, which she thought was very unusual. To me, these cases are endlessly fascinating, and I always have questions. I think we have to consider the possibility that that was in fact a normal human, and that perhaps that craft was a reverse engineered craft. But on the other hand, what the heck is it doing hovering right over this lady's car? Why is this human-looking figure staring down at her? I think there's another important detail that the lady expresses a little bit of confusion about time, how long she had this encounter. Was it a few minutes? Could she have had missing time? Because when there's a confusion about time, that is kind of a huge red flag that perhaps there is more to this encounter than is consciously remembered. Unfortunately, the witness has passed away, so that's going to be lost to posterity, but definitely an important and well-investigated case and an important addition to the whole catalog of UFO encounters, which by now is numbering probably close to 100,000. Guessing there's a lot more than that, of course, because as we know, most people do not report their encounter, particularly if it involves humanoids. So let's move along. We're going to Argentina now. I call this next case Amongst the Stars. This one occurred one evening in November of 1969 in a rural area called Hume, Argentina. This is a multiple witness case, although there is only one reporting witness. It's a pretty brief event, but I think has some interesting aspects to it that definitely deserve to have more attention paid to this case. This case was investigated by the South American UFO organization called Asociación de Observadores de los Astros, or the Association of Observers of the Stars. It appears in the March-April 1970 issue of the magazine Pegasus under the title Flying Disc Seen in Argentina. Again, this case involves multiple witnesses, though only one submitted a report, and this witness insists upon anonymity. The encounter occurred at 4 a.m. on a Saturday morning in the first week of November, which would probably make it November 8th. The witnesses were on the premises of a school located in the small town of Hume, Argentina, and they were there to celebrate the end of the school term. And as the witness says, "Suddenly I heard cries and shouts in the street. I thought it would be an assault or an accident. When I went out, I saw a strange spectacle. A group of people, formed by a school teacher and some pupils of the school, were, as if petrified, observing the developments of a flattened, elongated, disc-shaped object that was at an altitude of 200 meters. Once the first impression of observing such a strange scene had gone, I could see for myself that the object was like an inverted fountain, surrounded by a very red light. The UFO appeared about to land, and at this moment we could observe its shape with perfect clarity." Now at this point, the witness realized that this case was not just a simple sighting, a close encounter of the first kind, but actually a close encounter of the third kind involving humanoids. Because as the witness says, in amazement, we could see that the top part was transparent, and in its interior could be clearly seen 4 shadows of medium stature. Personally, I cannot say that they were beings. We only saw something that moved and had human form. After some moments, the object executed a sharp turn and at incredible speed without sound disappeared upwards amongst the stars, leaving a white trail behind. So now, fearing ridicule, all the witnesses refused to even go to the press. However, they did eventually agree to be interviewed by UFO researchers. And per these investigators, and I quote, "The witnesses of this strange and rare event were interviewed separately, all giving the same explanation. One of the witnesses said that trying to observe the UFO from the roof of a neighboring house was blinded by the intense glow that the object was irradiating. After an exhaustive investigation, the AOA gives authenticity to this case." The AOA, of course, being the Association of Observers of the Stars. When I hear that kind of case, my question is always why? Why is this UFO hovering so low in front of a group of people? To me, this looks like what we call a UFO display, where ETs are showing themselves intentionally in very much the manner of just introducing themselves. Obviously, that's pure speculation, but they have to have been there for some reason, and they weren't really doing anything other than coming down, looking down at these witnesses, and then taking off. So I don't know. You can make up your own minds about it. But there's a whole category of cases just like that. Moving along, we're now going to Georgia. This case I call the Aliens by the Ice Cream Shop. This one occurred on December 27, 1969 in Atlanta, Georgia. It's a multiple witness case. It's got some really unusual elements to it that I've never heard before, but it was pretty thoroughly investigated as well, and the witnesses are clearly sincere. This case comes from prolific and highly respected researcher Ted Phillips, and it first appeared in the June 1971 issue of Skylook in an article called, quote, "School Teacher Reports UFO and Occupants." Ted Phillips gives the main witness, the schoolteacher, the pseudonym Mary Smith. She was 25 years old. Mary and her mother had driven to Atlanta, Georgia to visit Mary's aunt. They were unable to find their aunt's house as she had recently moved, so they stopped at a coffee shop to discuss what they were going to do. Now it was 2 a.m., December 27, 1969, as they left the coffee shop to sit outside. There was a main street in front of them with streetlights, several stores around them, including a Dairy Queen across the street. Mary's mother was looking up at the sky, and this is when Mary looked at her and was talking about their next course of action, and suddenly Mary saw her mother's facial expression change. As Mary says, she had such a strange reaction. Her face was pale, and her eyes got big, and her mouth just dropped. I kept asking her what it was, and finally she pointed up and said, "Look." Up in the sky, about 4 stories high, Mary's mother was looking at a black saucer-shaped craft with a flat bottom. Mary didn't see it at first, as the object and the sky was very dark. But her mother saw the bottom of this object open up, and suddenly something came out. And this part Mary did see. As Mary says, "It looked like a plastic bubble dropped from the object. It rolled out through this door, and at this point, I saw it as it began falling. The bubble itself was illuminated from the inside by a white core of heat. I say heat because there were no flames coming from it, but I knew it was hot. On the edges, you could see the color that comes into a fire. It appeared cooler. The bubble was shimmering. It seemed to become irregular in shape. The shape of the bubble was constantly shifting, and I watched as it drifted in a fairly regular pattern. As it got closer to the ground, I was concentrating on the light within the bubble. I'm not sure. I cannot describe exactly what happened to the casing of this heat core, but it was like it had just melted off. As it fell, the core itself in this bubble divided into 3 parts. So Mary says that these 3 sections looked almost like arrows or prongs, almost touching each other, but they separated and went to the ground just beyond the paved section of the parking lot across the street, about 50 or 60 feet away from where they were sitting. The glow of these objects then dissipated, and during this time, Mary and her mother were talking excitedly, sharing and confirming each other's observations. Some other boys came up, but quickly left the area and then returned and watched with them. And this is when the strange humanoids showed up. As Mary says, "In a very little while, I was looking over in the parking lot and I saw a dark figure up close to the Dairy Queen building. I asked my mother if she saw it also, and she said that she did. This thing was about 5 feet 7 inches to 5 feet 10 inches. It was large. It had large shoulders and was husky in build. It tapered down into a very narrow waist with extremely thin hips. The head was extremely small for the body and came up to a point. The arms were shorter than normal. It appeared to be all black. We couldn't see any features." So as Mary, her mother, and the other boys watched this figure, they suddenly saw 2 other figures of the same appearance, although one was, quote, "extremely larger than the other 2. So the beings appeared to be in this location for a reason, as they began to perform a pretty unusual activity. As Mary says, "They had rake-like objects in their hands, though they were not rakes. They were long-handled, like a broom handle, and the bottom was a solid triangle. They were furiously sweeping an area of about 9 feet in diameter. It was as if they were beating something back. They had a basket of some sort with them that was sitting in the center, and as they swept things up into a satisfactory pile, they would reach down and put them into the basket. What they were putting in the basket, Mary couldn't say. At this point, the boys who had been watching along with Mary and her mother suddenly decided to approach the figures. As Mary says, they started their car and tore out to the spot in the parking lot. As they went through, this was the most terrifying part about it, I think, because of the fact that I was watching one of the figures, and I didn't see him run, and he didn't go up in a cloud of smoke, but he just ceased to be visible to me. My mother didn't see him either. When the boys got up to the spot where the figures had been, they weren't there anymore. They went through the backside of the parking lot and they did not come back. I feel sure that whatever we were seeing, they saw also." So the high strangeness of the incident was about to get even weirder, because at one point, as Mary says, while the figures were sweeping the area, whatever it was they were chasing seemed to run out to the edge of the street. The large thing followed it out with a triangular-shaped rake, was trying to beat it back into the group and couldn't get it. When it reached down, it had something in its hand that glowed. As it raised this thing up, the light in it just disappeared, and it ran back and put this thing in the basket. The figure's movements were in some sort of syncopated rhythm. It was like they were actually making time with each movement of their body. It was very jerky, but it was syncopated. Now, the researchers of this case speculated that this movement might indicate that the figures were in fact robotic, though Mary and her mother never said this. The witness does not say how the encounter ended, other than the figures simply disappeared, and presumably the UFO too. The 2 witnesses very nearly did not tell anyone about what happened. As Mary says, "We didn't report any of this because we were afraid of being ostracized for reporting it." Now I can guarantee that I was in a sober state at that time, my mother being a complete absolute Baptist non-drinker with a sober reputation. I can guarantee that we were not inebriated when we saw this. I think if I had been the witness to that case, I don't know how I would have reacted, but I'd like to think I would have walked a little closer and gotten a closer look at these humanoids so I could identify them more than just these sort of dark figures. But really unusually described in terms of having a very small head. We don't usually hear that. Broad shoulders, a thin waist. And what the heck were they doing with these weird shovel or rake-like tools? It's interesting to me because there are a number of cases where people describe exactly that. The weird kind of glass-like orbs, that's another detail I've only heard a few times. So there's a lot to unpack with this case, but certainly an interesting one. All right, now let's move along to a case that is definitely unusual. I call this one ape-like beings. This one occurred on one evening in July of 1973 in Greenville, Mississippi. It's a multiple witness case and a pretty unusual series of events. This case was reported to MUFON by one of three brothers who all witnessed an extraordinary encounter in the city of Greenville, Mississippi. One brother was 14 years old, the other was 12, and the third, the reporting witness, was 4 years old. I'll call him Jason. As Jason says, "We were moving some dirt around in the backyard of our home. My brothers remember hearing a screeching sound, which sent them running to the front yard to hopefully see a cool car speed away. After their disappointment, they returned to the back, where we noticed, near the same time, a disc-shaped ship hovering over the back of our next-door neighbor's house. I saw the door of the craft slide open, and a short, 3-foot-tall, ape-like being walked out onto a narrow catwalk that appeared to encircle the ship. He walked a few steps to my right and kneeled down and opened a small door on the side of the craft. He used a small tool to make some type of adjustment. While he was out, a second being walked to the door and watched him. The second guy was taller, maybe 5 feet. They were both covered in thick brown hair, but well groomed. Both were wearing a coverall, but not anything resembling a spacesuit like our NASA guys wear. The beings made no audible communication between each other and didn't pay any attention to the three boys silently staring at undoubtable proof of life on other planets. So the boys say they were no more than 30 feet away watching this whole event. After this hairy humanoid fiddled with the tool, the first ape-like being returned inside, the second as well, and the door closed. And as Jason says, after the door slid back down, the ship started ascending at a slow speed. When it reached about 100 feet, it ascended almost straight up and out of sight in 1 or 2 seconds. Needless to say, the encounter made a deep impression on all three brothers. As the youngest, Jason says, "My brothers knew they were looking at aliens. I didn't. I knew I had never seen anything like this before, but I wasn't old enough to know what an alien was. My oldest brother and I remember almost all the details the same." Sadly, the middle brother was later diagnosed with schizophrenia, and he can no longer accurately recall the event. The reporting witness in that case was, yes, very young, but of course his two older brothers saw it as well, so they were able to confirm each other's testimony. And here we have another case of a UFO hovering at very low elevation. And what's the most interesting aspect to me is the description of these beings as being short, hairy humanoids wearing jumpsuits. That's definitely something that has been reported before, but it's not super common. So I wonder about that. So many different types of humanoids. And again, what were they doing? Were they coming out of their craft to repair it or inspect it? And if so, why are they doing it right in front of these witnesses? Always questions, always more questions than answers. Certainly a fascinating case, and you can see it affected the witnesses quite profoundly. All right, moving along. Here's another case where the witness was very deeply and profoundly impacted. I call this one, "I'm Not Crazy. This Happened to Me." This occurred one evening in August of 1975 in Highland Park, Michigan. It's a single witness case. A young girl had an encounter with Greys, but it's definitely got some really important details to it, which I'll talk about after I cover the case, but I think they speak to the legitimacy of this encounter. The witness in this amazing case is anonymous, so I've given her the pseudonym Serena. She reported her case to MUFON about 31 years after it occurred. It was one night in August of 1975 that Serena, then 8 years old, went to have a sleepover with a girlfriend that had recently moved into the same apartment building where they lived in Highland Park, Michigan. At some point in the middle of the night, Serena woke up with the need to go to the bathroom. It was a long hallway to reach the bathroom, and as she did, she noticed a light shining from the bathroom, and this is when she saw a very strange figure. As Serena says, "I saw what I thought was a small child holding onto a doorknob, peeking out from behind the door. I could see his silhouette, and I thought, wow, he must be hungry. He looked skinny. So I took a step closer, blinking my eyes to clear up my sleepy vision, and as my vision became more clear, I turned my head to the left, and it mimicked me. That's when I saw the eye. It was large and black. So I turned my head to the right, and it mimicked me again." So Serena now got a very good look at what appears to be a typical gray ET. As Serena says, it had tiny slits for a nose and a dimple for a mouth. It appeared from behind the door, and then I noticed the 3 long fingers holding the doorknob. It had no clothes on. I could only see its one shoulder. Although it was dark in the hall with only the light from the restroom, its skin appeared to be a dark gray. So at this point, Serena took a deep breath, wet herself, and fainted. And the next thing she knew, it was morning. She immediately checked her underwear, but they were perfectly clean and dry. That puzzled her. So she checked the floor where she had fainted, and it was also clean and dry. This really confused her, and she wondered if perhaps she had dreamed the entire incident. So she decided not to tell anyone about it. Then, years later in 1986, by pure synchronicity, Serena happened to see an image of a gray alien, which immediately transported her back to that experience when she was just 8 years old. As Serena says, "I was 8 years old again, standing in the hallway, reliving everything over again like a time warp." Serena, of course, now believes that her experience was a real extraterrestrial visitation. As Serena says, "It was an alien. I'm not crazy. This happened to me, and I will not go on acting as if it did not. I saw an alien. They are here. They have been here for years." Serena believes that during that experience she may have been implanted because after that encounter she had trouble walking for almost a year, and she also found a strange deep indentation on her leg. She also learned much later from her friend that the family whose home she had been staying in may have also been having contact. It turned out that one of the family members talked about seeing an alien moving around the house, but the other family members did not believe him. Sadly, he eventually took his own life. And as Serena says, "I wish I could have been there because I saw the alien. I would have believed him." What's interesting to me about that case is that this girl saw these ETs in someone else's home, apparently with a family who's had previous encounters. So it looks like a chance encounter. But there was this detail that I found super fascinating in which she describes this gray ET sort of mimicking her movements. I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. It's something I think grays do to perhaps minimize the fear a person is feeling, or I don't know. It's a really unusual type of behavior, but witnesses will describe this, and they say it sort of does seem to reduce the fear factor and give a human aspect to these gray ETs, who I think are essentially human. They just look a little different from us. But look at all the people we have on this planet and how different we look from each other. But certainly a very profound case. I cannot blame the witness for thinking, could this have been a dream? Even though she was pretty sure it wasn't, given the unusual physiological effects she experienced. But then years later, seeing an image of a gray, she realizes, oh yes, this had to have been real. And quite a poignant and sad ending, given that one of the witnesses in that family clearly was not able to process his own encounters. So this just goes to show when someone shares this kind of incident with another person, I hope the other person takes it seriously, or at least listens with compassion and love, because this is a very difficult experience for some people to process. All right, moving along to another case which is quite controversial. This one got a fair amount of publicity, in the country where it happened. I call this one, They Looked Beautiful. This one occurred on July 4, 1978 on the slopes of Mount Etna in Italy. It's a fantastic case because it involves 4 witnesses, 3 of who are in the military, trained observers, I think very credible witnesses, and a very close-up encounter with different types of ETs, but some interesting aspects to it as well. This case was first published in the Italian magazine La Sicilia, but was later picked up by many other publications, including the Flying Saucer Review, Volume 24, Number 6, and Timothy Good's book Above Top Secret, and many other publications. This case involves 4 witnesses, including Franco Padigliero, age 27, Attilio Di Salvatore, age 30, both who were sergeants in the Italian Air Force, and Maurizio Esposito, a 21-year-old Italian naval officer, and his friend Antonina Di Pietra. So the witnesses were off duty, and it was on July 4, 1978 that they had decided to take a vacation by Mount Sona, which is located on the southern slopes of Mount Etna on the island of Sicily in Italy. This was a very popular hiking location. It was about 10:30 p.m. when they noticed 3 bright red pulsating lights in a triangular formation in the sky. And as these lights pulsated, they would grow larger and smaller. Suddenly, without warning, one of the red lights streaked down, moved towards the witnesses, and then suddenly went behind the slope of the mountain, only about 1,000 feet away, they estimate. The witnesses were naturally intrigued and curious and decided to get into their car and drive to the area to investigate. As they came around a corner on the road, they saw a dazzling bright light coming out from a dip or a ravine in the landscape by the road. So they stopped the car and went over to the edge of the ravine to look down, and to their amazement, sitting by a rocky precipice below them, about 325 feet away or so, was a classic flying saucer. They estimate it was about 40 feet wide. It had a glowing, illuminated yellow dome with red and blue lights on top. The rest of the saucer looked reddish, but most amazing, standing by the craft, were 5 or 6 figures. Now, 3 of these occupants, these UFO occupants, were very tall, and per the witnesses, they had shoulder-length blonde hair and were wearing white robes. They looked very beautiful, but the remaining 3 or 4 figures were much shorter and were wearing black jumpsuits and helmets. So 2 of these tall blonde figures now proceeded to climb up the slopes of this precipice, moving directly towards the witnesses, who now found themselves strangely immobilized. These figures kept walking until they were within 15 feet of the witnesses. The witnesses could now see that these figures were smiling, and in fact they opened their arms in a welcoming gesture. One of the figures nodded his head and pointed towards the saucer, and then both figures started to climb back down to the craft. So this was a pretty brief encounter, but very close. Now at this point a car passed by on the highway, and the lights on the flying saucer immediately went dark, only lighting back up after this car had passed. And as the tall figures reached the saucer, it began to glow with multicolored points of light, and the witnesses now found themselves able to move. They estimate that the encounter lasted 35 minutes. It's a pretty long time. As one of the witnesses, the lady, Antonina, says, "We were terribly frightened. While they were friendly and smiling and opened their arms to us, maybe we Earth people are the only ones who have evil feelings." So immediately after this encounter, all 4 quickly ran back to the car and drove to the hotel where they were staying as fast as possible. The UFO was still there when they left. They all say that they felt a strange euphoria, not only during the encounter, but for the next day and a half. And the witnesses did report one other strange effect. They said that following this encounter, all 4 of them felt strangely drained of energy. Now, the witnesses' story was met with some skepticism by some researchers, but in corroboration of their account, There were other reports of UFOs in that area at that time, and yes, these were very credible witnesses, and it certainly wasn't a single witness account either. That to me is a fascinating case because here this UFO comes down apparently for a landing, and they're very eager and curious and drive up as close as they can get and actually see this landed craft and different types of ETs. To me, the most interesting aspect is that two of these apparently human-looking, very attractive beings walk right up to these witnesses and are very friendly and smiling. And yet the witnesses are experiencing this extreme fear. I guess that's understandable because, again, when someone experiences something that's completely out of their worldview, it's very shocking, very hard to process. But this appears to be a wholly benevolent encounter. Also interesting was how the witnesses felt very unusual in the hours and days that followed this encounter. So always interesting aspects to these cases and how it affects a witness. To me, that's almost as interesting as the encounter itself. And I have to wonder if these witnesses were more receptive if this encounter would have been more than just a humanoid encounter and perhaps an onboard experience. Impossible to say, pure speculation, but these kind of questions always run through my mind when I hear these very close encounters. This next case is an important one, I think, because we don't get a whole lot of humanoid cases coming out of China, and I know they have a lot of them. This one is a multiple witness case as well, and it's a good example of a certain category of encounters where people see humanoids on an isolated road late at night. This case first appeared in the Chinese language magazine March in an article by Mr. Shua Jia Lin and was later translated into English by Mr. Shen Taoping and was published in the volume 33 number 2 issue of the APRO Bulletin in an article titled Occupant Encounter in China. The witness is Wang Jin Min, a driver for the Jinhua Chemical Factory in the Shiqing province of China. It was in the early morning hours of December 13, 1979, that Wang was transporting a load of silicon rocks on a road between Langxi and the Xinan River. At about 4 a.m., Wang was approaching the Wu Lun Temple, and suddenly he saw a car stopped on the road ahead of him. He slammed on the brakes and got out of his truck to ask the driver what was wrong, and the driver had an amazing story to share. He said that only moments earlier, he was driving when suddenly in front of him he saw a light as bright as an arc welder. Then he saw two very short, unusual-looking humanoids about 30 feet away crossing the road in front of him. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Wang was taken aback by the story. He smiled disapprovingly and asked the driver if there was anything wrong with his eyesight. Of course, the driver insisted that nothing was wrong with his eyes. Wang could clearly see that the man was afraid, so he offered to lead the way with his truck and allowed the man to follow him down the highway so that if anything should happen, Wang would encounter it first. The driver happily agreed, and the two vehicles set off down the winding mountain road. Now, Wang admits that he was slightly nervous, but he managed to concentrate on driving. Only a few miles into the drive, Wang now suddenly saw a bright blue light, which he said was like an electric arc, glowing ahead of him on the road. And to his amazement, he also saw two, quote, people standing by the side of the road about 650 feet ahead. He said these figures looked quite unusual. They were about 4 feet 9 inches tall. They were wearing silver clothes, much like an astronaut, he said. Each had a square box-like apparatus on their back and something like a thermos bottle slung over their shoulder. In their left hand, each held a short rod. Now, upon seeing these strange figures, Wang immediately put on the brakes of his truck, and then, to make sure it wasn't his imagination or a trick of light, he turned off the headlights and turned them back on. And of course, the two people were still standing there. Now afraid, Wang grabbed a crowbar and got out of the truck to confront them if necessary, but by this point the two figures had disappeared. Both witnesses later told researchers that they had never had any prior encounters before this and had never even heard of UFOs or humanoids. Wang did share his encounter with other drivers at his company, and he learned that during that time, 1979 to 1980, there was something of a UFO wave over China. And in fact, about 6 hours after Wang's encounter, 3 witnesses, all agricultural scientists, said that they saw a saucer-shaped craft flying southeast over the Hubei province. Such an interesting case. I'm so glad that both witnesses had each other to confirm each other's testimony. What's also interesting to me is this was an area where there's not a whole lot of people out there, especially at that hour. And the witness's description of these beings is unusual enough that I think we can say that these were probably not normal humans. Also, in confirmation of their case is, of course, the fact that there was a lot of sightings going on at that time. So definitely an important case. All right, now we're moving to the last and final encounter in this episode. I call this one, I Think We Were Abducted. This one occurred on September 17, 2007 in Newport, Kentucky, in a pretty crowded suburban area. 2 witnesses occurred in the early morning, not quite daylight. But what's so interesting to me is that there's physiological aspects, really profound spiritual aspects. The witnesses provided detailed drawings. The case was pretty thoroughly investigated, so there's a lot to unpack with this particular event. This case involves 2 witnesses, young men. The main witness is James and his friend is Cody. These are their real names, but their last names are not included in the report. At the time of their encounter, both were in 6th grade, and this would make them about 11 or 12 years old. They did report their case to both MUFON and Newfork. In fact, Newfork investigator Keith Bickford did investigate the case, and after investigating wrote, "I am classifying this as an anomalous sighting." So their experience began around 6:50 a.m. on a school morning on September 17, 2007. Each morning before school began, Cody would show up at James's grandparents' house in Newport, Kentucky, and Cody and James would walk together the 5 or 6 blocks to school. So Cody had arrived and was inside the house while James finished getting ready for school. But for some reason, James felt compelled to step outside the back door, and he unknowingly locked himself outside the house. This was when he very quickly noticed a strange, very bright light low in the sky. And as he looked at it, he could see it was actually a black rectangular object which was shining down a bright spotlight. And he immediately thought to himself, "What is that?" Because above it were 4 red spherical objects, and to the right was a smaller box-shaped object which was shining a beam of light horizontally near the Golden Tower Apartments across the river in Covington, Kentucky. So this large rectangular object had 4 rectangular windows, and as James said, I could even see that there were beings staring at me through the windows. As James says, it felt like there was an electrical charge in the air coming from this UFO. I have never been more terrified in my life as I gazed into the eyes of the beings as they peered out at me. It was so close up to me, I could see humanoids standing up against the window with their hands above their eyes as if trying to peer out of the windows. They had round heads and looked like typical grays. It was really bright white inside the craft. I was still pretty young at this time, and I never cursed at all, but I started screaming and cursing and kicking and banging on the door as hard as I could, trying to get my grandfather's and Cody's attention. Now at this point, an eerie silence had filled the area. In fact, James couldn't hear any dogs barking, birds chirping, or even the sounds of traffic. There was no sound whatsoever. Cody believed that the ETs were actually abducting someone else, and he was afraid that he might be next. So he was shouting, "Effing aliens are attacking! Help! Let me in! Somebody effing help me! Cody, open the door!" So finally, Cody came outside and weirdly shut the door behind him, unknowingly locking them both out. This infuriated James, who started calling his friend an effing idiot. Cody did his best to calm James down and shouted at him, asking him, "What the hell is wrong with you? What's the matter?" And as James says, as tears rolled down my face, I said, "Look, you idiot, aliens!" And he looked over at the spaceship, and I'll never forget the expression on his face. His mouth was open wide, and his eyes were like saucers. He basically pushed me out of the way and tried to run toward the craft. So James quickly grabbed the back of Cody's shirt and screamed, "We've got to run! We've got to get out of here quick!" Cody said, "Wait! Now calm down and get a hold of yourself. Take a look at this thing. What the hell is this?" So James managed to calm down enough so that they stood and watched this craft for about 6 seconds. And James said, "Look, there's like a box of energy field around it. It's coming out of those red orbs." Cody said, "Let's go into the street and get a better look at this thing." So it was still mostly dark out as they ran out into the middle of the street, and they could see that this craft was shining a beam of light again at the Golden Tower apartment building. And Cody said, "It's definitely abducting someone." Now at this point the object vanished. They didn't see it leave, it was just suddenly gone. And Cody said, "Quick, James, look at your watch. What time is it?" It was now 7:15 a.m. and James got a cold chill because it was much later than it should have been. As James said, over 30 minutes had passed. There was a significant amount of time lost. Cody and I just looked at each other for a second and he said, "Dude, we might have been abducted." I said, "No, I don't remember. I would have remembered that. Don't you think we would have remembered that?" And he said, "No, we would not have remembered that." I said, "But we didn't wake up somewhere else. We just popped back in the same spot." He said, "Exactly, dude. I think we were abducted." We didn't say any more words. We couldn't get back in the house. My grandpa had locked us out and wouldn't wake up to answer the door. We thought they wouldn't believe us anyway. Somehow still terrified, we ran down the middle of the street all the way to school. There were no cars and no people out yet. We ran all the way to the school. All of this kind of happened in a flash. It's like when we were near the UFO, maybe it sped time up or distorted time, and that's how they were able to abduct us, because we could feel this weight of energy all around us. We discussed this a little bit as we were running to school as fast as we possibly could. As we sprinted toward the school, the weight of it started to hit him, Cody. He began crying, repeating things that didn't make sense to me yet. He kept talking about the designs and the patterns, saying over and over again, "We were examined. They want us to get back to school on time." I was focused on the terror of what I'd seen, but he seemed to be processing a memory of being inside. I don't even remember running to school. We were just kind of there. So a UFO encounter almost always has a profound emotional impact, and that was certainly true of James and Cody. As James says, "When we got to school, we ran right up to the front desk and told the person behind the desk everything, and she took us to the principal's office. When we got there, we told the principal to call the military. He thought we were both delusional and crazy, so they took us to the therapist's office. The therapist believed us and even got the principal to talk to us one last time about it. They were both astonished at what had just happened to us. So the principal and the therapist both advised the boys not to talk about it with the other students as it might scare them. But the boys found themselves unable to stay silent. Their first class was art class, and both began to draw pictures in art class of what they had just seen and showed them to the other students. And as James says, "We got the nickname the Alien Boys." It's funny, because when I was in school, people always said I looked like an alien and acted like one too. Now when James got home, he asked his grandfather why he hadn't opened the door to let he and Cody back in, and his grandfather explained that he was already in bed and didn't want to get up. Now when James told his grandparents about what happened, they were at first very much disbelieving, but seeing how profoundly affected both boys were, they realized something had in fact happened to them. Later, James said he found strange marks on his body. He also found that his awareness seemed heightened. He began experiencing paranormal events, incredible synchronicities. And also, the day following the encounter, Cody reported a large rash or burn on his leg. And he went to the doctor, who treated him with sunburn cream. And as James says, something definitely happened to us that morning. Cody remembered everything, but I don't remember anything. He told me that we were examined on a table, but nothing really traumatic happened. They even spoke with us about propulsion systems and explained that they were more interested in me and were trying to prepare me for further contact in the future. He was talking all kinds of crazy, saying we were examined, and spoke with them about spirituality and propulsion systems, and then they said, "We've got to get you back down there so you can get to school on time." They were ugly, but they were just kind of people. And he just kept repeating this over and over. It all happened so fast. It gave me a newfound realization and a whole new perspective on reality. Cody said it was our waking stage in life. I didn't understand what that meant. But Cody became so terrified he never spoke about it again. He got rid of all of his drawings, and when I see him from time to time, I will ask him about what he remembers, and he'll immediately break down and say, "I don't want to think about it. I don't want to talk about it. It was so scary." And he'll say it wasn't that bad of an experience. It's more of the fact that they are not human, and the way they look scared him. He'll start crying. So James does report a lifetime of paranormal experiences after this, and following this 2007 encounter, he has had many dream encounters with ETs. He's become a deeply spiritual person. As he writes, "I am the embodiment of love, light, truth, and peace through compassion and understanding." A really fascinating and important case. It's very clear that the witnesses were impacted really profoundly. I mean, one witness doesn't even want to talk about it and becomes tearful whenever it's brought up. Again, absolutely understandable. But what's so interesting to me is that the primary witness, James, became a very deeply spiritual and compassionate person, at least, I think, partially as a result of this encounter. And this appeared to open the door for him having further telepathic encounters or OBE encounters with these ETs. Makes me wonder how many people are having these kinds of experiences but don't come forward. But this witness, James, felt compelled to report his encounter not only to MUFON and NUFORC, but to anyone who would listen. So interesting. So there you go, 10 cases from all over the world, close encounters with humanoids, all different types of humanoids, all having a lot to teach us about what it's like to have an encounter and why these ETs are here, and so many other interesting aspects. This subject is an absolute rabbit hole. I look forward to the day when these kinds of reports go mainstream and people don't have to worry about being gaslit or disbelieved or ridiculed. We're not there yet. And while, yes, governments across the world are now admitting to the truth of the ET presence on our planet, these congressional hearings that we're having and these recent file drops by the US government are really completely overlooking the fact that people are having direct face-to-face encounters with humanoids. So until that they can at least admit that that is happening, we have a very, very long way to go. That is one of the reasons I do this research. I know a lot of you out there are having these kinds of encounters. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, perhaps learned a little bit. Truly appreciate you watching. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun, and I hope to see you next time for another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Bye for now.